The Chinati Mountains, a cold night in March 1886. A bleeding woman crawled toward the only lit window, carrying a secret that would change a lonely rancher's life forever. She did not yet know the man behind that light, only that the truth inside her canvas satchel could hang the lawman hunting her, and that she had come too far and lost too much to die quietly in the frost. Holt Bracken had been alone on his high desert ranch for 2 years, ever since he buried his wife under the cottonwood behind the spring house and stopped expecting the supper table to need 2 plates. He was 34 that spring, broad through the shoulders from ranch work, quiet in the way men get quiet when the person they used to share a day with is gone. He kept 40 head of cattle, 6 horses, a barn he'd built with his own hands the year he married, and a silence in the house, so complete he sometimes talked aloud to the dog, just to hear a voice that wasn't his own answering back. He had let the garden Grace planted go to seed the first winter without her, then regretted it the second, and spent that spring trying to coax the beds back to life with a stubbornness that had less to do with vegetables than with not wanting one more thing on this land to finish dying. He was in the barn late that night, checking a mare due to foal within the week, when the gunshot cracked. Somewhere out past the north fence line, 1 shot, then nothing, the kind of nothing that follows a bullet finding its mark. He set down the lantern and listened, counting the seconds the way a man does when he doesn't yet know whether trouble is riding toward him or away. Nothing came. He decided it was a rider taking a shot at a coyote or a rustler spooked by his own shadow, and went back to running his hand along the mare's flank. It was perhaps 20 minutes later that he heard something else entirely, a sound low to the ground, dragging uneven breath ragged enough to carry across the barn floor, coming from the direction of the open door behind him. He turned with the lantern raised, and found a woman collapsed behind the water barrel, one hand pressed hard against her shoulder, blood black in the lamplight soaking through a torn sleeve, the other hand still gripping the strap of a canvas satchel, as though letting go of it mattered more than living. She was young, dark-haired, her face drawn tight, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running on will alone for longer than her body could sustain it. Straw clung to her skirt, and a long scrape ran down one forearm where she'd gone down hard on rock, somewhere in the dark behind her. She looked at him the way a person looks at the last decision they have left to make, and she did not let go of the satchel. He set the lantern down slow, the way he'd approach a spooked horse. He wasn't going to hurt her. He kept his voice low and even, hands open where she could see them. She stayed silent, breathing fast and shallow, her dark eyes tracking him with the wary precision of an animal that has learned hard what happens when it trusts the wrong stranger. Her gaze went to the rifle leaning by the stall door, then back to him, measuring the distance. Measuring what kind of man he was likely to be, measuring how much strength she had left if measuring turned out to matter. He crouched an arm's length away, hands open and visible, wanting to know quietly who had done this to her. She studied him a long moment before giving him anything at all. In careful English learned young at a mission school she did not care to name, she gave him one name in return, Deputy Silas Rourke. If Rourke found her in this barn, he would kill them both and burn the barn down after, the way every death near that man turned out, on paper, to be an accident. She asked nothing of him in return that first night beyond his silence, and he gave it without needing to be asked twice, kneeling there in the barn dust with her blood already drying dark across his knuckles. When he pressed her, once more on why she hadn't simply let the satchel go somewhere back along that arroyo and spared herself the weight of carrying it, she looked at him with an exhaustion too complete to leave room for anger. Letting go was exactly what the men chasing her wanted. She said a paper trail buried in the brush was as good to them as a paper trail burned. He didn't press again. There are answers he was already learning. That close, a question clean rather than opening 10 more, and hers had done that. He banked the barn's second lantern, low enough that no light would show past the doorframe, and told her to sleep if sleep would come. That was the first time Holt heard the name that would come to define the next month of his life, and he did not yet know it was the same name, worn on the same badge, that belonged to the man who 3 years earlier had put a bullet through his wife Grace on the Terlingua Road and ruled it an accidental discharge before the county judge. Plank of finding nobody with sense in that country had ever fully believed. Her name was Chenoa, and she was mescalero, born into a family that had lived in these desert mountains longer than any fence line or county line had existed to divide them. She gave him little that first night beyond the necessary facts, that she'd been shot near the arroyo 2 miles east, that she'd walked and then crawled the rest of the way toward the only light she could see across the flats, and that the satchel could not leave her hands, not for cleaning. It didn't press her further. He'd spent enough years reading horses and weather to know when the thing needed time before it would give up the truth, and a bleeding stranger with a bullet in her shoulder was not going to explain herself to a man she'd known for 11 minutes, no matter how gently he pressed. He carried her to the tack room, laid an old quilt over the workbench, and did what he knew how to do, boiled water on the kitchen stove and carried it back steaming, tore clean cloth from a shirt he no longer wore, and explained plainly that the bullet had gone clean through. She did not flinch as he worked, though her jaw stayed tight enough that he could see the muscle jump beneath her skin, and once when his fingers found the worst of the torn flesh at her shoulder blade, her free hand closed hard around a fold of the quilt and stayed that way until he was done. At one point she reached into a small pouch at her belt with her good hand and pulled out a twist of dried leaf, yerba de la vibera, snakeweed, she explained, chewed and packed against a wound to slow the poison in the blood, and pressed it into his palm without further explanation, trusting him to understand the instruction in the gesture alone. He used it, working it into the wound the way she showed him, with 2 fingers held up and a small motion of her chin. It was the first thing they built together, before either of them had shared much of anything true. By the time the wound was cleaned and bound, the eastern sky had gone the color of ash, and Holt understood he had a decision in front of him he could not undo by morning. A wounded Apache woman with a stolen army satchel and a county deputy hunting her was not a small thing to shelter, not in a county where Rourke's badge carried more weight than most judges' gavels. He thought of the empty house up the rise, the 2 years of silence in it, the garden gone half to seed, and the particular relief, one he was almost ashamed to name even to himself, of having, for once, a reason to move through a day with purpose larger than keeping cattle fed. He let her know she could stay in the tack room until she was strong enough to travel, and that he'd ask no more of her than she was willing to give. She looked at him for a long moment, the wariness in her face not gone but softened at its edges, and gave him one word in return, "Asho, Asho, thank you," before her eyes closed from exhaustion, and Holt sat by the workbench until full daylight, rifle across his knees, watching the door. He did not sleep that night, and in the gray hour before sunup he saddled his horse and rode out toward the arroyo she'd named, telling himself he was only checking the fence line, though he knew better. He found the sign easily enough for a man who'd tracked strays across this country for a decade, a scuff of boot heels in the sand where she'd gone down, a dark stain on a flat rock, and farther back, hoofprints of 3 shod horses that had turned and ridden hard back toward town rather than follow her trail into the brush. It meant the men chasing her had either lost her in the dark or decided a wounded woman, on foot in that country, wasn't worth the trouble of finishing by lamplight. He rode the rest of the fence line slower than he needed to, turning over in his mind what kind of woman carried a bullet 3 miles, rather than let go of a satchel, and what kind of man had made her do it. If a story like Chenoa and Holt's keeps you here past midnight, consider joining us properly, become a channel member, and tap join beside the channel name to support more of these tales. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them planned. Chenoa slept through most of the first 2, waking only for water and the willowbark tea Holt brewed. To bring her fever down, checking on her so often through the second night, that he lost count of the trips between the house and the tack room, lantern in hand. By the third day she was strong enough to sit upright near the kitchen hearth, wrapped in a blanket, watching him work with the sharp, assessing patience of someone accustomed to surviving on careful observation rather than trust freely given. She did not trust easily. She made that plain on the fourth evening, staring into the fire rather than at him, her voice low and even, but she had run out of other options, and a man who packed a wound with a stranger's herb without demanding an explanation was at least worth watching a while longer before she made up her mind about him. It was by that fire, over the slow accumulation of evenings, that they began trading the stories neither had put into words in a long time. Holt described Grace first, how she'd come west from Georgia with her father's cattle outfit when she was 19, how she'd laid the hearthstones of this very fireplace herself because a house wasn't a home, in her thinking, until a woman had put her hands in the mortar, how she used to sing off-key while she baked so the whole cabin smelled of bread and bad singing on Sunday mornings, and how he still sometimes woke expecting to hear it before he remembered. He walked her through the Terlingua Road, through the inquest where Deputy Silas Rourke stood before the county judge and swore to an accidental discharge during an escort gone wrong, through the account of the tax collector who'd ridden with Rourke that day and who later, quietly, to no one who could do anything about it, confided that the shot had come level and deliberate, fired from 20 feet with no wagon lurch to explain it, and then took a post in El Paso soon after, paid for, by all appearances, with money that had no business changing hands. Chenoa listened, without interrupting, turning a piece of kindling over in her hands, and when it was her turn, she gave it back in kind, slowly, the way a person hands over something they've kept locked away, because putting it into words makes it real again. She described her brother Isti, a horsebreaker known across 3 counties for gentling animals. Other men had given up on entirely. How he'd once tamed a spotted mare so wild the army post had condemned it for slaughter, working with the animal for 11 straight days until it would take a bit from his hand. And how that same mare had followed him on foot for half a day, when he rode off toward town without her refusing to be caught by anyone else. She explained that Isti had been framed for a killing he'd had no part in, that Rourke had produced a paper knife Isti sold to a trader years before, engraved with initials that weren't even his own, and used it as if it were proof positive of murder in a courtroom that had already decided, before the first witness took the stand, what verdict it wanted. Her voice went flat and careful the way a voice goes when a person is practiced not breaking over certain words, and she made him understand that the county had hanged her brother that winter on evidence a child could have seen through, if anyone in that courtroom had cared to look past the color of his skin and the badge on his accuser's chest. There was a night, midway through that stretch of evenings, when Chenoa asked him plainly whether he blamed himself for Grace's death, for not riding the Terlingua Road with her that afternoon instead of staying back to mend fence. Holt turned the question over a long while before answering. Every day, for the better part of a year, he admitted finally, watching the fire rather than her. Some days still. She didn't offer him comfort for it, exactly. She told him instead that her own family held no belief in blame laid on the living for what the dead had chosen to risk, that Isti had known the danger of going after that money as well as she had, and that carrying his death as her own failure would have been, in her mother's words. Holt sat with that a long while. It didn't unmake the year he'd already spent blaming himself, but it gave him, for the first time, another way to hold the same grief, one that didn't leave him quite so alone inside it. She gave him, too, the matter of the $340, an army payroll fund meant to carry Isti's widow and her 2 children through the winter that followed his death. Money Rourke had quietly diverted into his own pocket while filing paperwork claiming it had never existed. Chenoa had learned of it from a freight clerk in Alpine who owed her family a debt of his own and didn't dare raise his voice above a whisper about it. She had gone back for that money herself, alone in the dark, 3 nights before she crawled into Holt's barn, because no one else in that county was ever going to go looking for justice on her brother's behalf, and because a widow with 2 children did not have the luxury of waiting on a system that had already shown exactly what it thought her family was worth. That was what the satchel held. Not stolen army gold, as Rourke would later claim to anyone willing to listen, but recovered evidence, payroll ledgers with Rourke's own hand in the margins, correspondence naming the tax collector and the sum he'd been paid to keep quiet, and the very money he'd pocketed, enough together to prove exactly where it had gone and exactly who had taken it. Chenoa had watched a strongbox for 2 weeks from the ridge above Rourke's line shack before she found her chance, memorizing the pattern of when the hired men rode out and when the shack sat empty. And she had very nearly made it clean away before a ranch hand returning early spotted her, climbing out the rear window, and put a bullet in her shoulder as she ran for the brush line. Holt sat with that a long while before speaking again, feeding another piece of wood into the fire, mostly to have something to do with his hands. He gave her, finally, an understanding that a woman who'd walked 3 miles, bleeding rather than surrender that proof, had already shown him everything he needed to know about what kind of person she was. She, in turn, allowed that she understood why a man might build a life around silence rather than face an empty house every evening, and that she'd noticed these past few days how careful he was to put away the second cup he sometimes set out at breakfast before he caught himself doing it. Something passed between them that night that was not yet trust, not fully, but was no longer simple wariness either. The particular understanding of 2 people who have each buried someone at the hands of the same man, and are only beginning to realize they might not have to carry that weight alone. Over the following days, their evenings by the fire widened past grief into smaller, gentler territory. Chenoa wanted to know once how he'd come to ranching, and he walked her through his father's failed cotton land in East Texas and the drought that finally drove the family west when Holt was 16, through learning to read cattle and weather from an old vaquero named Refugio who'd taken pity on a green boy who didn't know a lariat from a ledro. She laughed at that, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch her as much as it caught him, and let him know that her own uncle had once made nearly the same complaint about her when she was 9 years old and terrified of the family's gelding, that some creatures needed to be broken to a thing slow, gentle, and repeated, whether it was a horse or a boy from East Texas or a wound 3 miles wide. She began in turn to describe her mother, a woman known through 3 settlements for her beadwork, abalone shell traded up from the Pacific coast, generations, back through a chain of hands Chenoa could still name, worked into patterns that marked a family's lineage the way a brand marked cattle. Patterns her mother had been teaching her the winter before illness took her. 3 years past now. She still had the unfinished belt in her pack. She admitted half the pattern done, and she hadn't been able to make herself finish it since, because finishing it felt like admitting there would be no more lessons. Holt offered no easy comfort in return. He only pointed out, gently, that Grace's garden had sat half-tended the same way, for much the same reason, and that maybe some unfinished things were allowed to stay that way a while before a person was ready. The false floor in the root-cellar got built during that same stretch of days, Holt working the fence boards and old barrel staves into a shallow crawl space behind the potato bins, deep enough for a person to lie flat and breathe quiet for an hour if it came to that, framed and hidden beneath a rug. He built it without being asked. Chenoa watched him measure the boards from the doorway one afternoon, arms crossed, sunlight cutting through the cellar's one high window, and pointed out that he didn't have to do this, that he could still ride to Alpine and report what he knew and let the law sort out a stranger's trouble through proper channels. Holt kept sawing and, without looking up, made his reasoning plain, that the law in this county wore Rourke's badge, same as it wore anyone's, and he'd rather trust a hole in his own floor than a judge who'd already let one killing go, as an accident once already. She didn't argue further after that. She handed him nails instead, kneeling beside him in the cellar dust, and for a while they worked in a quiet that had stopped feeling like caution and started feeling like something closer to companionship. She was stronger by then, moving through his kitchen with the careful economy of someone used to making every motion count, and she began, unprompted, to take over small tasks around the house, mending a torn bridle with stitches finer than any he could manage, resetting a hinge on the springhouse door that had squealed for 2 winters running, showing him a better way to dry the season's mesquite beans, laid flat on cloth in the shade so they wouldn't split and spoil. She reorganized his kitchen shelf without asking permission, and he noticed. It took him 3 days to stop reaching for the coffee tin in its old spot before his hand learned the new one, and that he minded the relearning far less than he expected to. Holt found himself watching her work more than he needed to, and catching himself at it, and looking away toward some chore that suddenly required his full attention. Neither of them named what that watching meant. There were larger dangers to think about, and both of them knew it, and both of them, if pressed, might have admitted that thinking about the danger was sometimes easier than thinking about the other thing sitting quiet and unnamed between them at the supper table. The first search came on the 5th day. Chenoa heard the riders before Holt did, 4 horses coming up the ranch road at an easy pace that didn't match the urgency of what they were looking for, a rhythm that, to a woman with long practice reading men who hunted for a living, meant they weren't expecting to find anything, only checking a box on a list someone had handed them. She was down through the false floor and the rug rolled back over it before the second knock landed on the door, lying flat in the dark, with her hand on the pistol Holt had pressed into her palm without a word 2 days before, his late wife's pistol, a small break-top Smith & Wesson that had sat in a bedroom drawer, unused since the day Grace died, and that Holt had cleaned and loaded again for the first time in 2 years, the same night he built the false floor. Rourke stood on Holt's porch that afternoon with 2 hired men behind him, lean and sun-cured, a badge that had seen better polish, and eyes that moved past Holt's shoulder into the house with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who enjoyed making people wait. He claimed he was looking for an Apache woman, armed and dangerous, wanted for the theft of Army property, and wanted to know if Holt had seen anyone matching that description in the last week riding through or asking after work. Holt answered flat, and even the same tone he'd use, quoting a buyer the price of beef, not a flicker of anything else showing in his face. Rourke's eyes lingered on the fresh sawdust by the cellar door a moment too long, and Holt felt his own pulse pick up, though nothing in his posture moved. Rourke pushed to look around the way a man poses a question. He already intends to answer for himself, regardless of the reply. Holt stood aside, arms loose, and watched the deputy walk through his kitchen, his bedroom, his barn, running a boot heel across the rug over the root-cellar door without pausing, close enough that Chenoa, lying beneath the floorboards with her breath held tight in her chest and the pistol's grip slick under her palm, could hear the leather creak 2 feet above her face and count each of Rourke's slow, deliberate steps across the kitchen floor. Rourke found nothing. He came back out onto the porch, studied Holt a moment longer than the search warranted, and left him with a warning that harboring a fugitive carried its own rope, same as the crime itself, and that a lonely man out here might be tempted toward company he shouldn't keep. Holt gave him nothing in return but a level stare, and did not exhale until the dust of their horses had settled a half-mile down the road, and the sound of hooves had faded past, hearing entirely. Before the next search rides in, take a moment, become a channel member and tap Join beside the channel name. It helps keep these frontier stories coming every week. Chenoa came up from beneath the floor, pale and shaking, not from fear, exactly, but from the particular strain of holding stillness against every instinct that pulls a person toward running, her knuckles white where they'd gripped the pistol the entire time, and Holt found himself reaching for her before he decided to, tenning her by the shoulders until the shaking passed and her breathing slowed to match the rhythm of his own. Neither of them named that either. Not directly, though Chenoa did admit, quietly, Once she trusted her voice again that she had not expected a stranger to build her an escape before he'd raised a single question about what she needed, and that this was not a small thing to her coming from a man of his kind. Something had shifted in the space of that hour. The two of them had stood together, however far apart in the house, against the same danger, and come through it, and there is a kind of closeness forged in exactly that furnace and no other. The weeks that followed were, in their way, the gentlest either of them had known in a long time. Chenoa's shoulder healed by careful degrees, and as her strength returned she took on more of the ranch work alongside Holt rather than around him, riding fence with him in the mornings, breaking a young gelding he'd been putting off for a season, because Grace used to be the one with the patience for green horses, and he'd never found it in himself since. Watching Chenoa work that animal, low-voiced and unhurried, coaxing trust out of a creature that had thrown every man who'd tried it, standing motionless for 20 minutes at a stretch until the gelding's ears finally came forward instead of pinned flat. Holt understood, for the first time in 2 years, what it felt like to want to stay and watch rather than find some chore to busy his hands with elsewhere. One afternoon she led him up into the foothills above the ranch to show him where her family used to dig the mescal roasting pits each autumn. A shallow depression, lined with river stone, blackened still from fires 2 generations old, the ground around it worn smooth by feet that had walked that same path longer than any deed or fence line on record. She walked him through the slow 2-day process of baking the agave hearts wrapped in wet grass over hot stones, until the whole hillside smelled sweet with it, a method passed down through her mother, and her mother's mother before that, and let him know, watching his face rather than the pit, that she hadn't expected to bring a rancher up here. Not after everything, but that it felt right to show him this one thing that was hers before. Whatever came next happened to either of them. Holt gave little in return, only that he was glad she had, and that he understood now why this ground mattered to her people in a way no surveyor's map would ever put down on paper. They talked more, too, in the evenings, about smaller things than grief, about the particular stubbornness of the gelding Holt was breaking, which reminded Chenoa of Estee's spotted mare, and which was the first time in the telling that her brother's name came without her voice going flat, arriving instead with something almost like fondness, threaded through the sorrow. She walked Holt further through her mother's beadwork lessons, showing him one evening the half-finished belt from her pack, laying it flat on the table between them and tracing the pattern with one finger, while she explained what each row of shell meant, and Holt, watching her hands move over the unfinished work, found himself thinking that he wanted very badly to see her finish it and to be there when she did. There was an afternoon, too, when Chenoa caught him favoring his left shoulder after a morning spent wrestling a fence post out of hard-packed ground, an old injury from a fall years back that flared when the weather turned, and she worked a heated cloth and a poultice of her own into the joint without being asked. Her hands sure and unhurried in a way that made the silence between them feel less like caution and more like ease. Holt found he didn't mind being tended to nearly as much as he'd have guessed, and said as much, and she told him plainly that a man who'd built her a hiding place under his own kitchen floor had earned at least one aching shoulder's worth of care in return. It was, in its own quiet way, the first time either of them had spoken the debt between them aloud, and neither one flinched from saying it. There were moments neither of them named directly, but both of them carried. An evening when Chenoa's hand brushed his passing a plate and neither pulled away as quickly as courtesy required, both of them going quiet for a beat too long before returning to supper, as though nothing had happened. A morning when Holt caught her humming, low and unself-conscious, over the mending, and realized it was the first sound of contentment this house had held in 2 years, and stood in the doorway a full minute just listening before she noticed him and stopped, embarrassed. "Don't stop on my account," he told her, the first compliment he'd risked since Grace, and one of the very few full sentences either of them spoke aloud that week, rather than simply understood. A night when a coyote screamed somewhere out past the fence line, and Chenoa, startled from sleep in the tack room, came to the kitchen doorway, and found Holt already awake at the table, rifle within reach. Having heard it, too, and thought first of her safety before his own, and she stood in that doorway a long moment, taking the measure of a man who kept watch without being asked to, before she wished him good night and went back to bed. And neither of them dwelt on how long that moment had lasted, or how neither of them had wanted it to end quite yet. But the danger had not passed, only paused, and both of them knew Rourke would return, likely with less patience than the first time. He came the second time on a gray morning, 9 days after the first search, and this time he brought 4 hired riders instead of 2, and no warrant, and none of the previous visit's careful patience. He rode straight up to the porch and ordered Holt to step aside, claiming word from a ranch hand who'd seen a woman matching Chenoa's description on this property inside the last 2 weeks, gathering herbs along the fence line at dusk when she'd thought no one was watching, and that Holt could either produce her or be charged as an accessory to theft of federal property, a charge that would see him hanged same as any Apache would be. Holt held his ground on the porch steps, feet planted, and made clear that Rourke had no warrant and no standing to search a man's home on a hired hand's second-hand say-so, and that the county judge would hear about this visit whether Rourke liked it or not. Rourke's men fanned out along the fence line without waiting for a reply, 2 riding toward the barn, 2 holding position near the house with rifles resting easy across their saddle horns, and Holt understood, watching them move with the coordination of men who'd done this kind of thing before, that this was no longer a search, and Rourke intended to end it. Here one way or another, warrant or no warrant, before he rode home that day. Rourke's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there the first visit, a man who'd run out of patience with the game and intended to end it that morning, one way or another. "Last chance to hand her over clean, Bracken," he said, resting one hand loose near his hip. "Otherwise I burn this place to the timbers looking for her, and I've got 4 men who'll swear whatever I ask them to swear about how it started." Holt didn't move from the porch step. He said the county judge would want an accounting of a burned ranch, with no warrant behind it, and that Rourke's 4 men had families who'd want to know exactly what their husbands and sons had sworn to, and why. Rourke's jaw tightened at that, the first real crack Holt had seen in him, and for a moment neither man spoke, the whole yard gone still as a held breath. Inside, beneath the floor, Chenoa lay in the dark, with the pistol gripped tight and her ear pressed near the crack in the boards, reading the tone of the voices above her as it shifted from procedure into threat, and she made, in that darkness, the same decision, that she was done lying flat and waiting to find out whether someone else's mercy would decide her fate. She waited only until she heard the 2 riders near the barn dismount and move toward the tack room, and then she was moving too, up through a gap in the cellar's outer wall. Holt had shown her, the week before, as a second way out, should the first ever be found, out through the spring house, and up the outside ladder into the barn loft, before either rider thought to look up, her state. It was in that moment on the porch, watching Rourke's hand drift toward the grip of his own revolver as he climbed the steps, that Holt put to him the question he'd been carrying 3 years, put it flat and clear enough for the hired men to hear every word of it, what exactly the threatening movement on the Terlingua road had looked like. B. The movement Rourke had sworn under oath justified putting a bullet through an unarmed woman driving a wagon home from town with nothing more dangerous in her hands than the reins. Rourke's face changed. Whatever answer he might have given died in his throat, replaced by the particular fury of a guilty man caught by his own history in front of witnesses he couldn't silence, and his hand closed hard around his revolver grip, thumb finding the hammer. The shot that ended it did not come from Holt. It came from the loft window above the barn door, a single clean report cracking across the yard and echoing off the foothills behind the house, and Deputy Silas Rourke folded backward off the porch steps into the dirt before his gun had cleared its holster, dead before he landed. Chenoa stood in the loft opening with Grace's small pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel in the cold morning air, her face set with a calm that would only break hours later, once it was over and there was no longer a need to hold it. She had not needed anyone's permission to decide she would not lie flat beneath a floor and wait to find out whether this time the search ended differently than the last, and in the second, before she pulled the trigger, she had thought, with a clarity that surprised even her, of her brother's face and her mother's unfinished belt and every reason she had earned the right to end this herself. The hired riders wheeled toward the barn at the sound of the shot, rifles coming up, and it was Holt who moved, then drawing and firing twice into the dirt at their horses' feet, close enough to scatter the animals without striking a man. He shouted over the chaos that the deputy was dead by his own reach for his weapon, and there was nothing here worth dying for on a dead man's account, that they should ride while riding was still an option freely given. 2 riders broke and ran without looking back, spurring hard down the ranch road in a spray of dust. The other 2 hesitated only a moment, looked at Rourke motionless in the dirt, his badge catching the gray morning light, and then followed the first pair, leaving the yard in a settling quiet broken only by the ragged sound of Holt's own breathing. Within a minute, the yard held only Holt and the body, and Chenoa climbing down from the loft ladder with the pistol still loose in her trembling hand, and a silence so complete that Holt would later describe it as louder than the coyote's scream through the wall that other night. He crossed the yard and reached her before her legs gave out beneath her, catching her, holding her upright against him while the calm she'd carried through the shot finally broke apart into something closer to shaking. He said nothing for a long while, only held on, because there was nothing worth saying to a woman who had just fired the shot. That both of them had understood, somewhere past words, was always going to fall to her hand and no one else's. The county sheriff rode out from Alpine 2 days later to close the matter, and closed it exactly as it deserved to be closed, an armed deputy. No warrant, 4 men advancing on a private home, reaching for his weapon before witnesses, against a rancher with a lawful wounded guest under his roof. Self-defense, the sheriff wrote in his report, and rode away without pressing too many hard questions about who exactly had fired the shot from the loft, because by then the ledgers Chenoa had carried out of Rourke's line shack were already sitting on his desk in Rourke's own damning hand, and no one left in that county was inclined to look a gift explanation in the mouth, least of all a sheriff who'd have to answer for it if the truth came out worse than the version already written down. In the first days of April, once Chenoa's shoulder had healed enough for the ride, she and Holt traveled 2 days north together, to the small settlement where Isty's widow had taken her 2 children after the hanging, staying the first night at a way station where Chenoa slept easier than Holt had ever seen her sleep. They mailed the recovered satchel by registered post from the settlement's small post office, the full $340 intact, along with the ledgers that cleared Isty's name for whoever cared to read them properly. Chenoa did not sign her name to the parcel, and did not go to the widow's door herself, though she and Holt rode close enough past the small adobe house on the settlement's edge that Chenoa could see smoke rising steady from the chimney, and, briefly, 2 children playing in the yard with a dog. Riding on, she gave Holt her reasoning that some gifts were better left without an author, that the widow deserved the money, and the cleared name without the added weight of gratitude owed alongside it, and that seeing the children fed and the chimney smoking was payment enough for the risk. Weeks later, a single careful page arrived back at Holt's ranch by a roundabout hand, thanking whoever had sent it, not knowing who that was, written in a careful schoolgirl's hand that Chenoa took to be Isty's widow, teaching herself letters in the evenings the way her brother once had. Chenoa read it twice by the fire and kept most of it to herself, only that it was enough, and folded it away into the same pack that still held her mother's unfinished belt. On the ride back from the settlement, Chenoa was quieter than Holt had seen her since the first days in the tack room, and when he finally asked what sat on her, she admitted it wasn't grief exactly, not anymore, but something closer to the strange weightlessness of a debt finally paid. Her brother's name cleared, his widow provided for. The account with Rourke settled in the only currency that mattered in the end. She said she hadn't let herself imagine what came after finishing that particular task, because for months finishing, it was the only shape her life had held. Now that it was done, she found herself looking at the open country ahead of them, and not knowing for the first time in a long while what she was riding toward, only that she wasn't in any hurry to find out alone. It was on the road home from mailing that parcel, 2 days of quiet riding through open country, turning green with the season's first rain, that Holt finally worked up the nerve to say the thing he'd been circling for weeks. They made camp for the night beside a shallow creek, and he sat across the small fire from her, turning a twig over in his hands, the way she often did with kindling, and worked his way plainly toward the point that the spare room up at the house had been empty 2 years, and that he wasn't asking her to stay in it as a guest much longer. Not the way things had gone between them these last weeks, and that, if she wanted a place that was hers by right and not by his charity, it was there for the asking, and he'd build her whatever she needed to make it truly hers, a workbench, shelving for her herbs, whatever she wanted. "That's as plain as I know how to put it," he finished, and then went quiet, because he'd run out of the courage it took to say anything further, watching the fire rather than her face while he waited to learn what she'd do with what he'd offered. Chenoa sat with it a while in silence, long enough that Holt began to think he'd misjudged the moment entirely and started rehearsing in his head some way to take the offer back gracefully. But when she finally lifted her eyes to his, she gave him a single word, plain as his own offer had been, "Yes," and reached across the fire without further explanation to take his hand. They sat that way a long while under a sky gone thick with stars, needing very little else between them, because there are things a hand held steady across a small fire says better than any speech a plain rancher knows how to give, and both of them, for the first time in years, felt no need to fill the quiet with anything at all. If you want more quiet, hard-won love stories like this one, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and walk with us into the next one. They married that spring in the kitchen, where Grace used to bake, the room still smelling faintly of the last loaf Chenoa had pulled from the oven that morning out of a nervousness she wouldn't fully own to, though Holt caught her twice checking bread that didn't need checking. She wore the abalone shell beadwork her mother had made her. Finished at last, she'd sat up 3 nights that week, completing the belt's final rows by lamplight, and let Holt know, when he noticed, that some things, it turned out, only needed the right season to be finished in, not forever put off. The pattern marked a lineage that had survived a hanging and a bullet and a corrupt man's badge, and was, that afternoon, still standing in a rancher's kitchen to be witnessed by the handful of neighbors who rode out for it. The same neighbors who had raised no questions when word got round of a wounded Apache woman living out at the Bracken place, and had, awed in their own quiet frontier way, decided it was none of their business how a man chose to build his life back up. There was no minister for hire in that stretch of country, so a circuit judge who owed Holt a favor from a cattle dispute years back stood in for one instead, keeping the words brief and plain, the way most things in that country tended to run, standing at the same hearth Grace had laid stone by stone with her own hands. A detail neither Holt nor Chenoa found strange to stand before, but rather fitting, as though the house itself had been waiting patiently to be lived in fully again. Chenoa gave her vow in mescalero, first low enough that only Holt caught the words clearly, her voice steadier than it had been in the barn that first bleeding night, and then again in English for the room. Holt would say afterward that he'd understood the first one before she ever translated it, in the way a person understands weather coming before the first drop falls, some things carrying their meaning past the barrier of the words themselves. By summer, the spare room that had sat empty 2 years had become Chenoa's tack and repair workroom, hung with bridles half mended and a shelf of drying herbs she'd started keeping for the whole county's use. Since word had spread quickly of the Apache woman on Bracken's ranch, who knew how to pack a wound properly and read a fever right, and never charged a struggling family more than they could spare. Neighbors who'd once have crossed the road rather than approach her now rode out for salves and advice, and Chenoa treated each of them with the same careful, unhurried attention she'd once given a stranger's bullet wound on a workbench in the dark, rarely mentioning, unless someone pressed her directly, where she'd first learned it. The cabin no longer sounded, evenings like a house with only one person breathing in it. There was mending on the table most nights and low talk by the fire that didn't always need to be about grief anymore, sometimes just about the weather or the gelding's progress, or a neighbor's gossip, ordinary talk that felt to both of them like the rarest kind of luxury. The gelding out in the corral had finally stopped flinching at a raised hand, the way some wounds, given enough patient work and enough time, do eventually close all the way. Some things take longer than they should to come right, a wrongful hanging that could never be undone, a wife lost on a road 3 years gone, a brother's name, cleared too late for him to hear it, cleared himself. But some things, given a barn door left open on a cold night and 2 people willing to trust a stranger's silence over a badge's noise, come right after all in their own slow season, the way spring comes to high desert country, not all at once, and never without cost, but steady and certain.